Hi, and thank you for joining me for another video. And friends, today we're going to cover one of the most, if not the most destructive mystical concept affecting the Jewish world today, and that is the Sefirot. Friends, I'm sure that you'll be surprised to hear that in the last 1500 years, no other idea has redefined Judaism like the idea of the 10 Sefirot. Because honestly, hashkafically, virtually everything is built upon it. And the truth is that, in my opinion, and the opinion of many others, it is the main virus that has and is destroying Judaism from within, from its inception. So what are the Sefirot? Friends, the 10 Sefirot are nothing less than an attempt to dissect and dismember God, Chas v'Shalom. Because truthfully, friends, the only way we can not only control religion, but the ultimate destiny of man is by dissecting God and thus telling humanity not only what God thinks or explain his thought process, but worse, predict what he's going to think or do next. How? Easy, by telling you that God resembles you and you resemble God. And because you resemble God, this system can also be used to define man and his destiny, not to mention all the secrets of creation. And all this, of course, from some supposed mystical authoritative perspective. In other words, sources with no sources in themselves, from books that just appeared on the scene during our exile, and most importantly, books that have no scriptural authority allotted to them. None, my friends. Unlike the Torah and the rulings of the Great Court sanctioned within Torah. And you're probably thinking, apart from there not existing a scriptural or Mishnaic source for this form of mystical inquiry or pluralistic duality of the Creator, what's the real practical harm? In other words, why oppose it if it doesn't affect you or I in a negative way? And the truth, friends, is that although the average Mekubal may be content with what Judaism has become in the last 1,000 years, the reality is that not just Judaism and Jews, but the world has greatly suffered because of this Kabbalistic invasion. Because, friends, although it may just seem like esoteric notions that only attempt to answer the secrets of the divine, you cannot attempt to define or redefine or supposedly expose the Creator and his will without it eventually trickling down and affecting every aspect of Torah, life, and thought. And since the virtual unanimous acceptance of the Sefirot as dogma, that is exactly what has happened. In other words, friends, this perversion has not only affected the way we view the rest of the world, it has ultimately affected the way the world views us. And friends, this is exactly why it was not a coincidence that the majority of the Jewish world's problems with the outside world arose mainly post the 13th century. Accusations of Jews being stingy, not caring for others, the separation between the Jewish destiny from the world's destiny, viewing the world tribally instead of ethically. In other words, not between the decent and the indecent, but between Jew and non-Jew. Not to mention establishing the idiotic notion of the intrinsic value of Jewish blood over the supposed irredeemable Gentile. All principles, might I add, solidified within the 10 Sefirot that had ultimately led to Judaism becoming the ethically, socially irrelevant mess it is today. But anyways, friends, one of the first things you will hear from the leadership in the Orthodox community today on why we cannot question or oppose anything that has been accepted is on the very fact that because it has been accepted. In other words, you will hear that this or that, because so many important rabbis have held by it in the past, must be true. But friends, that's not good enough, not to mention that it is not the way Torah Judaism functions. And friends, I know that this topic is extremely difficult to understand, which in my opinion, makes it even more dangerous, mainly because it typically has people just relying on those they find more charismatic and or confident on the issue, and not necessarily on who makes the most sense theologically. Which is why I will try to use analogies that the modern mind can understand. So, what are the 10 Sefirot? Friends, the 10 Sefirot, or literally the 10 emanations, is the vehicle that the Ein Sof supposedly reveals himself through. Who is Ein Sof? Friends, if you said God, you are only partially correct, because according to Kabbalah, they are both God, meaning the Ein Sof and the Sefirot. Partially God, again, according to Kabbalah's opinion. And the best way I could describe this is by telling you to picture how a computer is put together. So the Ein Sof is the motherboard, while the Sefirot is the CPU. Now, one would assume that the Ein Sof, which is referred to as the endless one, be the CPU. But as the Kabbalists teach, the Ein Sof is ultimate nothingness and is not truly activated until translated by the Sefirot. Again, the CPU. And friends, if this does not sound confusing enough, building on the notion that creativity breeds innovation, the Mekubalim have even established one higher than the Ein Sof, known as the Atzmut, the divine essence, which is taught to be, again, on a higher level than the Ein Sof himself, which I will describe in my picture as the case or chassis that both the CPU and motherboard are housed in. Okay? So far, we have lightly described the Atzmut, the Ein Sof, and the 10 Sefirot, that according to Kabbalistic thought, all make up the God of the Bible. Now, the 10 Sefirot, which the Kabbalists claim makes up the body of God, are most popularly depicted as Keter, Chochmah, Bina, Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, and Malchut, also sometimes called the Shekhinah. We will get into these characters in depth later, like how Yesod is affectionately known by the Kabbalists as the circumcised penis of God, or how Malchut is the head of that penis, or the labia of God's supposed vagina, according to Kabbalah, but we'll get to this. And I know that just hearing this makes you cringe, and it should, mainly because the Kabbalists have single-handedly undone one of the Torah's major achievements in the monotheistic world, and that's the desexualization of religion. Mainly by turning our lawgiver into a hermaphrodite that has sex with itself. Chas v'shalom. And friends, one of the main reasons that this perversion has almost gone unchallenged in our generation is mainly due to how it masquerades as sound theology. For example, if you skeptically ask the average Kabbalistic rabbi to explain the Sefirot, he will just say that they are the 10 attributes displayed by a good God, to the point that he will even quote Pesukim and Chumash, showing you how they're all there, and that's it, right? You walk away satisfied, but know that this is not what they believe, and this is not what they teach their students in yeshivot, but rather it's just a throwaway line to calm the skeptics. And friends, as I continue breaking down the Sefirot, or the Godhead of the Kabbalists, please do not be shy to begin comparing it with what has been traditionally called Avodah Zarah in Judaism, particularly the idea of the Trinity of the Christians, which no Christian would ever describe as 3 separate gods, but rather identically to the way the believers in the Sefirot call their mystery of the one God, represented in at least 10 independent attributes, personalities, or partsufim. Eye-opening, huh? Actually, I think you will see by the end of this lecture that Trinitarians are actually in numerous ways more monotheistic than Kabbalists of today. And being that we just mentioned the clearest disunifying factor within the Sefirot, we should discuss that notion a little further, the notion of partsufim, or personas within the Godhead. Now, it seems almost that the Sefirot themselves, being fully divine and independent from each other, isn't the only theological problem we have to deal with. In other words, instead of worrying what these 10 Sefirot may one day come to resemble in Judaism, in the sense of it further resembling Christianity, the Kabbalah itself has already fast-forwarded its descent with the creation or revelation of the partsufim, or personas that arrive from the Sefirot. In other words, the partsufim are a further subdivision of the Sefirot themselves, division that actually become literal independent personalities of the Godhead. Of course, in their mind, still making up one God. In other words, so far, we have the Atzmut, which is the case, the Ein Sof, which is the motherboard, and the Sefirot, which is the CPU. Now, we have to deal with the branding, the partsufim. In other words, what model, what brand, or what style is the computer described as? In other words, the labeling which Kabbalah describes, at least in terms of the partsufim, as the Atik Yomin, the Ancient of Days, which derives from Keter or Dat, the Sefirah of Keter or Dat. The Arich Hanpin, the long face, which also comes from Keter. The Ima, or the mother, which comes from Binah. The Abba, or the father, which comes from Chachma. The Zeir Hanpin, the son of the Godhead, the son of God, which comes from Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, and Yesod. And Netzach and Hod are also called the knees of God. And finally, we have the Nukva, or Nekeva, or the divine daughter, or heavenly mother, that comes from the Malchut, also sometimes called the Shekhinah, the female aspect of God. And of course, Kabbalah still teaches that although these are completely independent from each other, they still make up one God. How independent are they? Well, so much that according to Kabbalah, they even have sexual intercourse amongst themselves. Friends, I'm not kidding you, this is what it's taught. They also teach that the goal of Jewish practice in this world is not literally to bring goodness to the world, but to cause the intercourse between the male and female personas of the Sefirot, which is yet another reason why Judaism does not progress ethically nowadays. Why? Because its theology is no longer built on ethics alone and what it produces, but rather on some celestial orgy that calls the shots. And friends, it gets worse. For example, have you ever inquired about the Trinity of the Sefirot? Absolutely. Represented in the Atik Yomin, which is also the transcendent, i.e. the Holy Spirit of God, or the Abba, which is the Father, or the Zeid Anpin, which is the Son. And of course, I must not forget our Catholic friends, the Ima, which is the Divine Mother. This is ridiculous. That's why virtually any educated Messianic has the average Jew beat nowadays, because they can and have justified virtually every theological concept within Kabbalah and the Sefirot. Why and how, friends? Because Gnosticism is not new. In other words, what we call Christianity today once resembled a light form of what is considered Kabbalah nowadays, before it completely broke away. No, friends, the problem with the Sefirot and the Kabbalistic world in general is that when it broke away, it took the whole Jewish world with it, which actually has most Jews theologically wondering what they really believe after all, especially after they get confronted by an educated Kabbalistic Messianic that is able, again, to justify all he believes from what has been accepted as Judaism nowadays, which I teach is not true Judaism. And if any good Jew tries to use the Pashat found in Torah, let's say in the Shema, to try to disparage any notion of God, chas v'shalom, being made up of some compound unity, they can't. Why? Because the Zohar, a commentary in the Torah, has redefined the Shema through the Sefirot. In other words, it interprets the Shema as Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. And what? And these three are one, it says. Did you catch that? It incorporates the Partzufim in every phrase of the Shema itself, making the Christian argument for the compound unity. Thank you, Zohar. Now compare that to exactly what the New Testament says about the Trinity. For there are three that testify, the Spirit, the water, and the blood, and these three are one. Friends, the Sefirot is the Trinity on steroids. As a matter of fact, Mekubalim also have a name for their own Trinity. They call it the Atzilut, the highest of the four worlds, where the Godhead of Keter, also known as Dat, Hakma, and Bina sit, like we mentioned earlier. In other words, the Atzilut is the Kabbalistic Trinity, and I'm sure you will not be surprised to hear that it is where Chabad derives its name from, because as you know, Chabad is not a word, it's an acronym for Hakma, Bina, and Dat. And what? With a name like that, did you just think that they were great proponents of education? And the Zohar also does the same thing with the phrase in Bereshit of let us make man in our image, attributing it to the plurality of the Sefirot. And even with the kiss the sun pasuk in Tehillim, saying that the sun is a Zeid Anpin of the Sefirot. Because the truth, friends, is that history does repeat itself. And again, although the Zohar was not written until the 13th century, these ideas had permeated the Jewish world even before our temple was destroyed. And the only difference is that it was known by different names back then, mainly by what the ancients referred to as Gnosticism, which, like we said, was the root of the early and later Nazarene sect, which eventually became Christianity, to the point that we can even see those roots sprouting within what's known as Kabbalah nowadays. For example, regarding the Atzmut we spoke about earlier, Chabad writes that the Rebbe, their Rebbe, is the Atzmut, or the divine essence, embodied in a man, which is identical to what the New Testament writes about JC, that Christ is the essence of God in bodily form. Wake up, people. And friends, the next part of this concept I want to discuss is the way they limit our omnipotent God. For example, apart from their doctrine of the emanation of the divine, that by the way goes directly against the biblical principle that God does not change, they have actually gone further and developed the Kabbalistic doctrine of Tzimtzum that attempts to explain a contraction or limitation of the Ein Sof, chas v'shalom. A contraction or limitation, as they teach, that it's necessary in order for the sephiroth to do their work. So what you have, my friends, really is a heretical doctrine developed to sustain a previous heretical doctrine, and on and on. In other words, for the Almighty to be fully omnipresent, he must be present in total. However, the Kabbalistic idea of Tzimtzum, on the other hand, results in and requires a partial presence or void of the Almighty. Friends, so much is built or assumed on a made-up notion, mainly because we don't ask what's authoritative anymore, or just because some bearded man is yelling it, it must be true. And this, friends, is what happens when you think and teach that God not only changes, but never stops changing. And if you think about it, it's the only way cults are created, by stating that God has decided to reveal more, or is doing something new, or like in our case, has left his will fully in the hands of man and their actions. Because as they teach, we are the biggest manipulators of these Sefirot. Now, friends, the basis of this lecture is not to say that these concepts necessarily don't make sense, but that Rather, they just follow and justify an unbroken chain of other heretical ideas that should never have been accepted in the first place. For example, in terms of Tzimtzum, this concept is now deemed necessary in the mind of every Kabbalist to justify the work of the Sefirot, and on and on. So in our computer analogy, the Tzimtzum would be the box that the computer is delivered in. Not protecting the computer from the outside, but rather protecting and separating the outside from the computer. Yeah, I know it's a little complex to understand. Anyways, friends, another fact you might have not known is the fact that the Sefirot gave birth to many of the occult practices that are alive and vibrant even today, like the popular tarot card system of fortune telling. Not to mention that Kabbalah is also responsible for other such practices like palm reading and brow reading, not to mention the curses that nowadays Kabbalists put on people they hate, like the infamous Posa de Nora, which I guess one day they'll put on me. But again, if you ask the average rabbi on the validity of the Sefirot or Kabbalah in general, he'll tell you that it's mutter, it's kosher. Now, friends, don't get me wrong. Judaism in itself does not frown on new ideas or innovations. But in terms of attempting to define and ultimately dissect the Almighty, the inquiry is heresy in itself. In other words, in regards to the divine or the metaphysical, if the concept does not derive directly from the only revelation man ever received from God, i.e. the Torah, it only exists in the realm of opinion, and certainly nothing to build doctrine on or from. In other words, after the mystics have developed the intrinsic explanation on not only what makes God tick, and how the universe came into being outside of the narrative found in Torah, they began to teach it alongside of Torah, also referring to it as Torah, which is why today, in the Jewish world, it is indistinguishable from Torah. Which is specifically why the Torah, the only guide we can use to establish metaphysical principles, taught us in Deuteronomy 29:28 that the secret things belong to God and only the revealed things belong to us and our children forever. Telling us that there may seem to be esoteric, unanswered portions in Torah thought, but these things we must not dwell on, and worse, on a whim, incorporate our conclusions on them as part of Judaism. Now, I know that's a lot to process, so I'm going to slow it down now. Now, I typically try to analyze the topic that I'm covering a little further in depth via authoritative sources before coming to a conclusion. But the truth is, friends, that because there is no trace of these ideas in anything Judaism holds as authoritative, i.e. the Torah or Mishnaic literature, it makes it virtually impossible to even call it officially part of Judaism, with the exception that about 99% of the Jewish world adheres to it. And honestly, I barely just scratched the surface on the 10 Sefirot. There is so much new material written on this topic on a daily basis that really putting the cat in the bag seems almost impossible. Almost, friends. And friends, if you're sick and tired of all the nonsense you have been force-fed in the Jewish world and are eager to understand Judaism, Torah Judaism, from its purest form, I want to welcome you to visit doordea.com. Thank you.